Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jon Sue-Ho. People call me Jon Sue-Ho. I am a support advisor in the WRC Systems Group. I will be talking to you today about building powerful LDAP configurations. Specifically, we'll be going over two exciting new features of LDAP available in InterSystems IRIS 2018.2, so ones that aren't even out in the wild yet. So before we start, a few things we're not going to be talking about delegated authentication with LDAP, so writing your own custom code. You can schedule a session later. There are some great resources about that. But today we're really going to be focusing on some new exciting features, and this will be most exciting for those of you who barely know what LDAP is, but also very exciting for those of you who do. So what are we doing today? Well, first we're going to have a word about coexistence, about having cache / ensemble and IRIS together in an environment and how great LDAP is for that. Then I'll be telling you a story about how LDAP can make your life much better, especially if you're so successful that you have 1 million instances. We'll have a quick overview of what you can do presently with LDAP and cache and InterSystems IRIS. And then we will talk about those exciting things up and coming in the near future. We'll have a demo, a real live look at those features, and then quick wrap up. Okay, so word on coexistence. Product management has really wanted me to get you guys comfortable with the idea of, well, introducing IRIS into your environment. So maybe, you can't just suddenly convert all of your cache ensemble instances to InterSystems IRIS, but you can spin up a new IRIS instance, leverage some of that functionality. This word coexistence means that some technology will be kept compatible between IRIS and cache ensemble, so it'll be easier to interconnect them, things like ECP for direct access to that. And LDAP, while not maybe directly in there, LDAP features will be kept compatible with each other, so what you set up for your InterSystems IRIS instance can also go in the future into your cache instance. Again, the features we're looking at today are unreleased, so they won't be arriving until InterSystems IRIS 2018.2 and later for cache ensemble. So, that being said, let's take a look at why you need LDAP. Let's say you have an instance. You have an application, you have some databases and namespaces. Well, that's a little boring for our case, so let's pretend you instead have a bakery. Well, actually, let's make it a little bit more like a data platform. You have a bake query. And you have a variety of users in your instance. You have an owner, you have a baker, you have a cashier, and they have different responsibilities, and they need access to different resources. Your cashier needs to be able to access the register, your baker the oven, the owner the entire instance. And so in conventional cache password authentication, you would create a user profile and assign it its roles and permissions, which for our analogy, we're just going to refer to as assigning roles. So you need to assign roles. And of course, different users are going to have different roles, some more than others. And again, that really means create this, configure that, create this, configure that, create this, configure that. Okay, you can do that for one instance and 3 users until you become too successful. And then you spin up another instance, another installation, because you're so successful that you need it. And so you go through again and you assign all of your roles to all of your users, meaning you create this and configure that, and create this and configure that, and so on and so forth. Which is fine until you become more successful and you spin up yet another installation, this time overseas. And so you have to go into that instance and configure those roles. They're different roles because they're French. So, again, that means doing a bunch of these. And then you become successful yet again, and you decide you need another overseas installation. So you have a Japanese instance, and so you have to assign roles again. And that means you have to do this again. And in aggregate, okay, that's not that crazy. You have 4 instances, 3 users, meaning that you need to make a dozen of these profiles and maintain them, except for the fact that you don't really have 3 users, do you? Let's be conservative and say you have 10 users. Okay, 10 users times times that many. You've got a bunch of cashiers, a bunch of bakers, your owner has a mom who won't mind her own business, so she minds her daughter's. 40 user profiles. You're a savvy admin, you can deal with that. Until you become more successful. So successful that you have to bring in an outside consulting firm to help you handle your success, and they all need access to all of your instances, so you do more of these. And they say, hey, stand up a test instance. We're kind of appalled that you've been this long without it. And then you need to give everyone access to that. And then they want an analytics instance so they can poke holes in your business plan. And so you do more of these. And then you become more successful. And the consulting firm says, hey, you should start serving appetizers to your customers. So you spin up some app servers. And the consulting firm says, hire an outside firm of waiters to staff the app servers. They'll have to wear different hats, so you have new instances and new roles that you have to assign, meaning you need to do this again, and then you're successful. So successful you're able to buy your largest competitor and get all of their installations and have to hire all of their employees and configure and deal with their roles. And so you do more of these, and then you become so successful that we actually have to throw the bakery analogy out the window and go back to a normal instance, which the consultants decide, hey, you should add a sharding instance. You should coexist. So that one sharding instance is the master for 4 other instances, which you've all decided to mirror. So this ends up looking more like this, which, if you've been keeping track, still isn't mathematically enough for all the work you have to do. And even when we take it back to bread, still not that pretty. What if I told you there was a better way? A way in which roles could be kept track of almost automatically. A way in which different groups wearing different hats got their permissions assigned to them. A way in which there was a central repository for all of the, oh, that's out of order. A way in which there was a central repository for all of the roles to be drawn out of. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you LDAP. So, well, what the heck is LDAP? Very quickly, LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol according to the X500 standard, so on and so forth in this RFC. It's a directory. It's organized in trees, and it contains objects, which could be anything, but you're really going to care about user objects and group objects. These objects have attributes, which have values. A user might have an ID number, an email, a password, what have you. Groups can have user objects as members, and users can belong to group objects. And they'll have, in those attributes, they'll specify which groups they belong to, and vice versa. What does that look like? Well, later we'll be looking at Microsoft Active Directory, a very popular LDAP implementation, but not the only one. Here's a third-party tool that I use to deal with yet another kind of LDAP server. All right, so what does this look like inside your InterSystems IRIS or Cache instance? Well, let's take a look at all of this. So you've got things like when you make a LDAP configuration to connect to your LDAP server. You give it a name, you tell it what machine to connect to, you give it a user in the LDAP domain that can search the rest of the tree, you tell it what unique things are on there, you tell it to use SSL TLS encryption unless it's a test system because you care about whether people can see your password over the network or not. And then we get to the neat stuff. Use LDAP groups for role routine namespace. Let's take a look at that. So, like I said, there are attributes and there are groups. The old way of doing things back in the day was to use your InterSystems instance configured to use your user objects attributes. So you would go in and create some attributes. You could call them whatever you want and specify what they were called in your LDAP configuration. And you would tell the instance, hey, when this user logs in, go to the LDAP server, find these attributes for the user, and look there to find out what roles it has, what routine it runs in terminal, what its default namespace is. And it was nice because you had a centralized repository for all of your instances, but you still had to go in, create these attributes, which isn't always the prettiest thing to do, And you had to do this for every single user. Well, you only had to do it once because centralized, but, well, we could do better. And we did. Oh, so here's an example. So here, Patty Cake has some attribute for namespace. She's going to go to the oven namespace when she logs into the instance. She has some other attribute for roles, which has this list of roles she has, %developer and oven portal user. And when she logs into terminal, she will run this routine, which we could specify in the config, dinner roll. As I said, we can do better, and we did. Starting in 2015.1, we started allowing you to use group assignments to specify the role, namespace, so forth. So you create some groups with very particular names, InterSystems-role-some role that exists on your instance, InterSystems-namespace-some namespace that exists on your instance, and then you assign the users in the LDAP server to be members of that group. So instead of going in and editing, just say, okay, be part of this group. And you can do that for a whole bunch of users, just have to create one group. Example. So the Todd Baker user belongs to all of these groups, the InterSystems-role-%developer group. So when he logs in, he's going to have the %developer role, which should be configured on your instance. This group has these members. Therefore, whenever these users log into the instance, it's going to call out to the LDAP server, say, oh, assign them that role. Great. Drawbacks to this. Well, you saw there was nowhere in there where we specify an instance name or any other identifier. That means the role or what have you is going to be the same in every single instance. So you can lock users out by just specifying a role required to log into the instance, saying, oh, they don't have this role, they can't get into the instance. But if you don't have that, you let them into the instance, they have, well, whatever roles the LDAP server said. You couldn't make that different on different instances. What you could do was define the roles differently on each instance, but that could be really hard to keep track of, remembering that on one instance, that role doesn't have the same permission on another instance. Again, it's okay if you have maybe 2 instances, but if you're very successful, have lots of instances, that's going to be rough. You could not have that role at all, but again, do you really want to be dealing with that sort of non-uniformity? Which brings us to the future. InterSystems IRIS Data Platform 2018.2 and these neat features. Okay, so first thing, group IDs and instance IDs, which give you different roles on different instances. And then, quick word on multiple domains. So, these are new. These were not in your configs before. You can specify an authorization group ID and an authorization instance ID. You can specify these to be whatever you want, and then you can change your LDAP group names to include them. So, authorization group ID lets you specify that this role, this namespace, this routine should be for this particular group. Again, you configure that when you configure the LDAP configuration in your instance. Here we're going to call it domestic. And so instead of InterSystems-role-%developer, it's going to be InterSystems-group-domestic-role-%developer. So it's only going to apply to instances that have their LDAP configuration set up to have that in the name. Well, why would you need or want to group these things together? Some possible examples. All of your reporting systems in one group, your production systems in another, ECP app servers in one group and data servers in another, all mirror members in one group and keep other mirror members totally separate because they're in a different mirror. And with the new InterSystems IRIS functionality of sharding, I'll put a shard master and all of its shard servers in one group. Great. An authorization instance ID works exactly the same way. It's just another field, another bit of granularity. The default value is going to be the machine name underscore the instance name, but you can change that to be whatever you want. In the example we're going to look at, one of the instances is just going to specify computer underscore main, and you'll see the others. We've also added this fun checkbox. So the old syntax without the group or instance ID no longer works unless you check this box. If you're happy at having it the old way and want to keep it, well, you can have that. Just check that box. But otherwise, you should use the new, more granular way. Ta-da! Okay, the other exciting thing, multiple domains. So before, you only got one of those pages. You could connect to one LDAP server, search one domain, get those users. Now, you can make as many of these as you want. You can connect to your main company's LDAP server. The consultants have their own LDAP server. You can connect to that. You can specify a different group or instance authorization ID. Grand. Make as many of those as you want. So let's take a look at this in action. So going back to our bakery example. All right, we've scaled this down a little bit. So instead of the multitude of instances you saw there, we're going to have 5 instances: a bakery main instance, a bakery France instance, a bakery Japan instance, which we're going to group together, and 2 app servers, bakery app 1 and bakery app 2. We're going to have these users sorted by domain. Again, they're in different domains. We're going to have Debbie owner, Todd baker, and Alan cashier. In the BakeQuery domain, the Balding waiters domain is going to have Mike waiter, and the Windy Heller consultants domain is going to have Marcia consultant. Now, these are the roles that are going to control the different applications. Let me explain what those applications are. So each instance has an oven namespace and a register namespace. And you can access them either by the terminal or by a web application. So the oven portal user role has permissions to access the oven namespace via the web application. The oven terminal user role allows you to do it via the terminal. Similar roles for the register namespace and, of course, the lovely %all role, which gives you access to everything on the system. So here's a little map detailing all of the different things that we want for all of the different kinds of users. So the bakers, for the main instance, should have access to the oven namespace both through the web app and through the terminal. For the France and Japanese instances, we only want to give them terminal access. So we're going to do that. And they should not have access to the app servers. Similar setup for the register namespace for the cashier users. The owners can and should have access to all of the instances with %all. The waiters we want to have locked out of everything but the app servers, and we want them to have %all there. And the consultants should have %all on the main instance and no access to everything else. This is a lot. Mostly know that we want our bakers to have access both portal and terminal on the main instance, no access on the app servers, and partial access only through the terminal on the international instances. So to accomplish this, we're going to specify some group and instance IDs. Like we saw before, for our main instance, we're going to call the group ID domestic, the instance ID computer_main. For the France and Japan instances, we're going to give them the same group ID of international and different respective instance IDs, Ordinat France, Computa Japan. Those just mean computer or compute in those languages. For the app servers, we're going to put them in the same group, but I've actually decided I don't want to give them instance IDs, so they're just not going to have them. I want everything that happens to one to happen to the other, and no ability to configure them separately. So let's have a demo. So let's take a look first at the configuration page. So here is my management portal for my main instance. There are some things you have to set up here, and I'll be glad to talk with you about those later, but let's just look at the configurations, look at my multiple configurations for the different domains. And all the things we set up before. And note that I'm not encrypting because this is just a test, but in anything real, please do use SSLTLS because I don't want to see your password. So we've specified that, those group and authorization IDs here. Similarly, on the other instances, just like in that chart that we saw earlier. Okay, so what happens when I try to log into the main instance as Todd Baker? Oh, well, first let's look at Todd Baker in the in the LDAP server. So here's the LDAP server. Todd Baker is here. Let's see what groups he's a member of. He's a member of the Bakers group. And the neat thing about Active Directory is we can use nested groups. There's a checkbox here for that. Active Directory has nested groups, meaning we can put groups inside of groups. So Todd Baker belongs to the Bakers group and therefore belongs to all the groups that the Bakers group belongs to, which includes the InterSystems-group-domestic-role-oven portal user. So he is going to get this oven portal user role and therefore is going to have web access to the oven namespace. The same one here for access to the terminal oven namespace. And internationally, InterSystems-group-international, he's going to get this role, which is going to let him into the terminal, but he doesn't have the oven portal role for international, so he's not going to be able to get in there. You'll note that we don't have anything that says AppServe, so he's not going to be able to get in there just like we want. We've also specified default namespaces for him by instance. So he's going to be in the oven namespace for all three of these instances, and he's going to run a different routine for each one of these instances. So let's see what happens when he tries to log in here. So Todd Baker at bake-query.com. Yum. So he got put in terminal access and run the default routine. Okay, now he also has web access to the main instance, just as we saw. So he can log in here too. Beautiful. But when he tries to go over to the register namespace, he's not going to have access because we didn't give it to him. Ta-da. He's not going to have any access to the app servers, just as we specified. That went away. Yep, access denied to the app server. Also up here to the app server, he's not going to have access either. A little latent. Yep, grand. But for those international instances, we're going to see that down here in the terminal, he'll have access. For both instances, but again, he's not going to have access up here in the portal. Oh, no, I'm still in the app server. So, nope, doesn't get in. Well, what if I want to change that? I can go back to my LDAP server, decide, you know what, I do want him to have access to the web application internationally after all, so add him to that, add this group, InterSystems-group-international. So we're going to give oven portal user internationally, InterSystems-group-international-role-oven portal user. Quite the mouthful. We're going to save that. And now, Todd Baker will be able to get into the international instances via portal access. The Japanese oven just needs to sear spicy tuna rolls. Okay, so pretty neat, huh? But, like I said, we are not just limited to one domain. So let's take a look at our other domains. So Balding Waiters, set up totally differently. It's not even to an Active Directory server. And like I said, we gave no group ID on the main instance because we only want, like we showed in here, we only want access for waiters to the app servers. So it's all set up with AppServe. So let's take a look at what this looks like on the app server. So like we said, gave it the authorization group ID of AppServe and no instance ID. If we go over to our, here we see that Mike Waiter belongs to the InterSystems-group-appserve-role-% group. So for the apps instances that specify the AppServe ID, we'll get %all. So when he tries to log into the main instance, he'll get nothing. Mike Waiter at baldingwaiters.com. Access denied. But in the AppServe instances, would you look at that? And the same for the other app instance. Beautiful. And because he's got %all, he also has, let's open this again to get new sessions. He also has access to both applications for both app servers. So he can have their app servers, they have tinier ovens and tinier registers. And that's for both of these. And similarly, the register here. But again, no access over here. Nada. Okay. All right, so fun little proof of concept, but reminding you again what the significance is. So we did it for this many users, which again was really this many users and this many users and this many users times the multiplier to make it real life. And we did this like very, very easily for this many instances. But again, just in our story, that's this many instances and this many instances and this many instances plus however many instances you have in real life. And this many roles plus, any other funny little role-related things you may have. This is real. This is big. This is powerful. There's a lot of things we didn't cover. You can go in and play with LDAP right now. There's a first look in the Learning Services site. You can connect to a test LDAP server. Again, the features I demoed are in 2018.2 InterSystems IRIS, so they're not out yet, but you can go play with a single LDAP configuration page up there. There's a lot of wonderful documentation. If standard out-of-the-box LDAP does not meet your needs, you can write your own LDAP. You can use LDAP APIs to write a Z-Authenticate code and have your authentication be whatever it needs to be. You can also search our lovely InterSystems developer community for other questions, other solutions, other problems related to LDAP that people have run into, or you can open up a WRC problem. Well, I'm not going to leave you here. I'm going to leave you with more puns. So if you really want your business to be able to flower, so you can be rolling in the dough, you'll need to rise to the occasion and make this idea more than just half-baked. I'm sure you'll find that it's a piece of cake and will allow you to not only have your cake, but eat it too, because these new LDAP features just might be the best thing since sliced bread. Okay, please ask your questions. I have, oh, yes, sir?
You had said IRIS, but are these features also part of like caching ensemble as well?
Yes. So let me explain this. So the features I just demoed, the multiple domains and authorization groups, these are scheduled to come out in InterSystems IRIS 2018.2. At some point, they will also come out in Cache and Ensemble. But right now, you can connect to, in all InterSystems products, you can still connect to any single LDAP server and use any of the prior authenticate groups and rules that I said there. And again, product management wanted me to stress the idea of coexistence. You will be, in the future, you will be able to set up the same thing, the same group names, and all of that, set this up so that you can use LDAP as the single authentication mechanism to both any InterSystems IRIS instances you have and any Cache or Ensemble instances you have.
If you're using a single LDAP user, you still have to do a username at domain? Or is that how the login is?
So if you're only using one LDAP configuration, so you, as things stand right now, you don't need to do that in existing versions because there's only one domain and it will check it. In the future, you may need to specify that. I believe that you can also specify a default domain. One thing that I didn't get into is there's actually sort of a mixed configuration called OS authentication with LDAP authorization. This allows you to delegate the so I don't want to use the word delegate to confuse you. This allows you to trust that the operating system has authenticated you and has checked the username and password, and then send that off to the LDAP server to retrieve the roles and attributes to assign you whatever you need. So you say the operating system can handle the authentication to prove the identity, and the authorization, the assigning of all of these roles. We send the username off to the LDAP server to handle that. And because in the past, this wasn't a big deal because you only had one domain. In the future, if you have multiple domains, we don't know what username this is. So there's actually a field where you can specify an environment variable to check to see which domain it should use. So if you're using that sort of different flavor, it'll say, oh, well, look here, that's the domain I want. But there's also specifying a default domain. There's all of that. But in short, if you have lots of domains, you probably want to specify which one. Yes, sir?
On a mirrored environment, do you still have to set up both your primary and your secondary?
Yes, sir. Let's address mirroring for a second. Common misconception of mirroring. Mirroring does not replicate your configuration. Mirroring replicates your data, your application data. All of your users, all of your security, all of that is separate, and maybe you want it to be separate. Maybe, again, deviating from LDAP and just talking about mirroring, maybe you want your DR async to have different users or different everything else than your primary. Or if you have a reporting mirror member, that could look completely different than your primary environment. So again, mirroring only replicates your data. It does not replicate any of your settings, which is why it's so powerful to be able to set this up. So one thing I should touch on is there is a way for you to export your LDAP configuration. There is a way for you to export your users and a way for you to export your roles. And why this is so powerful now is you export that role, you import that role into all of your other instances. You don't have to change what that role means. You don't have to say, oh, in this test instance, that role has fewer permissions. You can just slap that role across instances and use the LDAP server to say, okay, just don't give them that role. Only give them that role under these naming conventions. Yes, sir?
So you can export your LDAP from your domain and then import it?
No, sir. Let me show you exactly what I mean. You can export your LDAP configuration from inside your instance and send it to all of your other instances. Now, you want to change it afterwards, but well, let's go in here. So up here, all of this is going to be the same. Where your server is, which user you want to do the search, all of that's going to be the same. But your authorization group and instance IDs, you might want to change those afterwards. But you can export this entire thing right here and right now. So let me go in with a user that has %all. You can just go into Caret Security. You can go to your system settings. You can go to your LDAP and Kerberos configurations, and you can export those. So export, and question mark to see all of them. So 1, 2, and 4. I don't want to export the default one that got installed. So, yep. So LDAP configs export a.xml parameters WNS. Yep. Yes. So it got exported to this file in my MGR directory or whatever path you specify. It contains all 3 of those configurations, and you can just take that file, import it, plop it down. So here's another important thing that maybe you should know about. So you do all of the configuration of your users on the LDAP server. So you'll notice here that it's labeled as an LDAP user, and you actually can't edit any of its properties. You cannot assign, you can see its roles, but you can't change any of this because that's on the LDAP server. This is not a regular cache password user that you have control over. And if we delete it, let's delete Debbie. We can actually delete it, but it will be recreated as soon as we log back in. And Debbie's back. So again, that's all handled on the LDAP server. You don't go in and do that. Other things. So here I showed the exporting the LDAP configuration, which you can later change. Now, what's really powerful and why this works is the fact that you can export those roles. So let's export all of these roles, which I've set up on one of my instances, import those, and they can look exactly the same on all the other instances. So that one, that one, that one, and that one. Yep. Ta-da. All right, further questions?
When you exported those roles, did it export everything that contained these roles?
The resources underneath those roles? It does not. You need to handle that separately, which is not that much harder.
So if we export a role that doesn't have that resources, and you import it, you can't assume that.
You cannot assume it will be there. It will actually fail to import if you haven't already imported the resources. So you can also export the resources, import those first, then import the roles that have those resources. And again, you can also, there's a test button here for when you're setting these up and debugging them. We can go in and test that. Yep. You can see that we're using nested groups, which is a very powerful feature of Active Directory. And we tested logging in Debbie a whole bunch of times. So in your cache or ensemble instance, this is going to be located somewhere else. Actually, I set that up, so why don't we do that? In the 2 minutes we have left, please continue your questions. But I can show you that this already works with existing cache, ones that don't even have the new functionality. So if I go into my owners group, so Debbie owner belongs to the owners group, and in addition to all of these very specific ones that have IDs, she also belongs to this one, InterSystems-role-%all. So in this existing released ensemble instance that I have set this up to point to the bake-query server and allow all that. So if I try to log into this instance as Debbie owner, you'll note here I don't specify the domain because there's only one. So again, useful even before the new exciting functionality comes out. Okay, well, we only have a minute left, so if there are no other questions, I'd be happy to take those, but if not, I'm Jon Sue-Ho. People call me Jon Sue-Ho. Please call the WRC for any of your needs. If you want to discuss this further, you can schedule a one-on-one training session with me or one of my colleagues here at the conference. We are here to help you. Literally our job, so thank you.